Hello class, this is Chapter 1, The Evolution of Community Policing. The learning objectives we're going to cover in this chapter are as follows. We will define community policing, explain what Sir Robert Peel's principles emphasize, summarize the 3 eras of policing, and identify and describe the 4 essential dimensions of community policing. Community policing is a complex and evolving trend that may be considered both a strategy and a philosophy. Community policing is often regarded as one of the most significant trends in the history of American policing. Scholars and practitioners suggest that community policing continues to evolve. As society's needs change, so do the methods it uses to quote-unquote keep the peace. Efforts to involve the community are occurring throughout the entire criminal justice system. They have persistently evolved throughout American history and continue to evolve. Community policing is an organization-wide philosophy and management approach. It is designed to reduce crime, disorder, and fear of crime itself. 4 principles define community policing: community engagement, problem solving, organizational transformation, and crime prevention. In the 1980s and 1990s, strategy emerged that put the emphasis on knowledge management, teamwork, and partnerships with the community. In 2300 BCE, Sumerian rulers codified a list of offenses against society. This was the beginning of the early onset of codification of offenses against society. In the early Middle Ages, a tithing system established a principle of collective responsibility for maintaining law and order. In 1066 CE, William the Conqueror established the Frank Pledge system. The Frank Pledge system required all free men to swear loyalty to the king's law and maintain local peace. In the 17th century, citizens and officers participated in day and night watches that gave a hue and cry if disorder or trouble was spotted. In the Industrial Revolution, this led to unemployment, poverty, and an increase in crime, especially in London. The Metropolitan Police Act of 1829, instituted by Sir Robert Peel, and this of course was in London, ushered the era of modern policing. Sir Robert Peel was really responsible for the beginnings of modern police forces. He was largely responsible for the Metropolitan Police Act, and Sir Peel proposed appointing civilians to be paid by the community to serve as police officers. Interdependency of the police and the public helped with the prevention of crime and disorder. He envisioned a close police-citizen relationship to help maintain order. With the beginning of modern policing in the United States, those who came to America and in 1620 and their descendants through the American Revolution rejected the British Crown's rule that permitted British soldiers to take over homes and have complete authority over the colonists. Our founders wanted to ensure that no such power would exist in the newly created nation. As former Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court Warren E. Burger stated, the founders, conscious of the risks of abuse of power, created a system of liberty with order and placed the Bill of Rights as a harness on government to protect people from misuse of the powers. Nonetheless, the system of policing and maintaining order in the northern part of the United States was modeled on the police system developed in England. As far as early policing in the United States, at the same time the Metropolitan Police force was established in London, the United States was still operating under a day and night watch system similar to the one that had been used in England. In the 1830s, several large cities established separate paid day watches, and in 1833, Philadelphia became the first city to pay both day and night watches. Boston followed in 1838 with a 6-officer police force. As far as policing in the southern states, it had different origins. It was based on the slave patrols found in the southern colonies and states. By 1700, most southern colonies, concerned about the dangers of oppressed slaves and what they could create, had established a code of laws to regulate slaves. These codes prohibited slaves from having weapons, gathering in groups, leaving the plantation without a pass, or resisting punishment. Predictably, the many slaves resisted their bondage. According to Foner in 1975, the resistance usually consisted of running away, criminal acts, and conspiracies or revolts. Compounding the problem was the fact that slaves outnumbered the colonists in some southern states. For example, in 1720, South Carolina's population was 30% white and 70% black. In most colonies and states, patrols could enter any plantation and break into slaves' dwellings, punish slaves found outside their plantation, and search, beat, and even kill any slaves found to be violating the slave code. Even after the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, free men of color, quote unquote, were hired as police officers only to enforce Jim Crow laws that supported segregation and helped keep the nation's black population in line. So policing in the southern states differed greatly from policing in the northern states. Now, there were 3 eras of policing. The first was the political era, which dated 1840 to 1930. This unfortunately had close ties to politics and corruption. It involved patronage and spoils systems. Wickersham Commission was formed and addressed lawlessness in law enforcement. During this political era of 1840 to 1930, the police were closely tied to politics and participated in the often corrupt patronage system. And as I mentioned, the Wickersham Commission was formed to reveal the inefficiency and corruption of the political era of policing. The reform era was 1930 to 1980. This was begun by August Vollmer and O.W. Wilson. This is also referred to as the progressive era, and it ushered in drastic changes in the organization and function of police departments. Innovations included fingerprinting, radios and patrol cars, social work training, and the professionalization of police forces. The thin blue line was established during this era. In the 1960s and 70s, the social and professional quote-unquote awakening of the United States highlighted the issues of race relation, corruption, and the use of force in police departments. Continuing with the reform era of 1930 to 1980, there were several crime prevention programs put into place. There were 5 national blue ribbon commissions that were established to respond to and address the negative image of policing during this period, and reform measures were introduced. One was the President's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice. The next was the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, also known as the Kerner Commission. The next was the National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. Also was the President's Commission on Campus Unrest. And then the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals. Court decisions limited police rights and clarified the rights of the accused. One
outcome was the exclusionary rule, which was Weeks versus the United States, which was ruled on in 1914, and also the Due Process Clause, which was Gideon versus Wainwright in 1963. There were other reforms as well, or other court decisions formed as well. One was the rights of confessions and confessionees, and this was the ruling of Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964. This is a very famous ruling. Definitely you need to read about this. The next is the right to have a lawyer present, which was Miranda versus Arizona in 1966. This brought about the birth of the Miranda rights and is often called the Miranda ruling. This was extremely important to American policing and justice. And then there was stop and frisk, which was Terry versus Ohio in 1968. In the mid-1970s, reform in policing had slowed due to the questions of whether or not the progressive model was effective. There were other problems and challenges during the progressive era, those involving immigrants, mental patients, and Vietnam veterans. There was also a study, a very famous study, called the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Study. And also came the controversy and role surrounding that of private security. Now, we've talked about the first two eras of policing, and the third era we're going to talk about now is the community era, which is 1980 to the present. This involved community involvement, which was increased to fight the quote-unquote war on crime with the goal of proactive rather than reactive policing. This adopted many of Sir Richard Peel's original principles. Some of these features of community policing included regular contact and a mutual respect between officers and the community itself, and the aim of officers to be role models and empower citizens to become involved in the community. Now, this chart is table 1.2 from your book, and it outlines the three eras of policing. And it's a very good chart because it breaks down the three eras. It also shows the developments and outcomes of each of these three eras. It's very important that you take a very close look at this and also walk away with a very good understanding of these three eras of policing and how they continue to affect policing all the way up to today. Now, here's a discussion question, or a question for you to consider. How did policing in the community era respond to the problems associated with the reform era? Let's talk about some of the features of community policing. Redefining the role of the officer. There should be regular contact between officers and citizens, and these should be well-defined roles. There should also be both proactive and reactive policing. In other words, full service and direct service officers. There should also be citizen cooperation in setting police agendas, and there should be police accountability. In other words, police should absolutely be accountable for their actions as well as following the law. And officers should be representatives as leaders and catalysts for change. One of the very great challenges facing policing right now in 2020 is that of the prosecution and persecution of minorities in this country, and the great disparity between how white citizens are treated versus minorities in this country. Here is a question for you to consider. You need to speculate on how police in the political and reform eras may have responded to the current Black Lives Matter movement. How could police respond to this movement according to a community policing paradigm? Now, there are some essential elements of community policing. The first is the philosophical dimension. This advocates for citizen input, a broadened function of police, which is protecting vulnerable populations, and a personalized service based on local norms and individual needs. There is the strategic dimension, which calls for reorienting operations, a geographic focus, and a prevention emphasis. The next is the tactical dimension. This translates philosophical and strategical approaches into programs and practices. Now, let's talk about democracy and the police. There are core principles that guide fair and democratic policing. The first is to engage the community to help create and maintain trust. Maintaining rights to privacy while protecting national security is a very big issue that's facing the United States at the moment. Also, regarding democracy and the police, diversity should be taken into account when devising police strategy. There should also be a commitment to police integrity and combating racially biased policing. There should also be a successful working relationship built between law enforcement and the media. And there should also be openness and police innovations involving openness through technology. That should be encouraged. Now, here's a good question for you to consider. Discuss amongst yourselves with a study group, or discuss with your own self contradictions associated with the idea of quote-unquote democratic policing. In what ways is democratic policing desirable, and in what ways is it undesirable?
Now continue with democracy and the police. You have the COPS office, which was formed in 1994, which helps advance the practice of community policing. It also provides grants and training to tribal, local, and state law enforcement agencies. It also provides community police training and technical assistance while maintaining an online resource information center for all agencies.
Now, to summarize some of the things that we've talked about in this chapter, there are two basic themes, which are the police community collaboration and a problem-solving approach. Also, remember that quote-unquote modern policing began with the London Metropolitan Police, based on principles set forth by Sir Robert Peel. As far as policing in the United States, it has three distinct eras: the political era, reform era, and the community era. And there are four dimensions of community policing, which are the philosophical, the strategic, tactical, and organizational. As always, class, I encourage you to contact your instructor should you need any clarification or you need any help understanding any of the concepts addressed in this chapter. Thank you, as always, for your time, and we'll see you next class.